Thank you for coming out to the opening of our Mozart Festival. How many of you came to the lectures last year during the Brahms one? Good, good, good. Because these will be equally informative, instructive, and you will learn everything and more than you ever wanted to know about Mozart. Before I introduce our scholar in residence, I usually spend this time to say something about an element of the program that might be interesting to you. And for this, as we did for the Brahms, you will notice eventually that the orchestra is placed on the stage in a slightly different setup than is our norm. Yes, the first violins are still there, but the cellos, usually in there, are moved over there. The violas, they didn't move. Second violins are over here and double basses are over there. Winds are normal. Why? I don't do it so much out of historical context, which is the way orchestras most likely sat in Mozart's time and really basically to the middle of the 20th century, but rather the nature of this kind of music where the second violin's part is so independent from the firsts that placing them together to do this when you have a regular subscription concert with a myriad of composers, it doesn't quite, for me anyway, work. Much music of the 20th century demands that the violin sections be placed together. So with that in mind, I think you'll find the sound interesting. Even the timpanist, by the way, is playing mostly on smaller drums with wooden sticks. Aside from that, we don't try to imitate necessarily the style of performance that might have been prevalent in Mozart's time. We play it very much as versions that you would hear in the mid-20th century and through today. It's exciting. This is a lot of fascinating music with a lot of fascinating stories, and you're about to hear the very first of them. Our scholar in residence comes to us from Vassar, where she's associate professor of music, and I'd like to introduce to you, and for the next 3 weeks, Kathryn Libin.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It looks like such an exciting festival. And it's really wonderful to be at a Mozart festival where all of the music is literally by Mozart and not colleagues of Mozart and before Mozart and after Mozart, but actually the man himself. So in thinking about this talk, I began looking over some of the literature and realized that 2 of the words that pop up all the time in relation to Mozart's music are universal and miraculous. And both of these are complicated. The concept of universality seems to stem from the accessibility of his music, its ability to cross boundaries of time, place, and culture. The idea of the miraculous originated in his own time, indeed in his childhood, when people encountered in him a kind of rare genius they had never before seen. And this idea persists today in works such as Amadeus that present him as an unlikely but genuine voice of the divine. In the brief commentaries on Mozart and his music that I'll be offering throughout this festival, I will acknowledge that both universal and miraculous are apt words to describe the phenomenon of Mozart. But I also want to give some idea of what Mozart was like as a person, based on the very substantial body of evidence that survives from his lifetime, and also what he was like as a man of the late 18th century and as a citizen of Europe in the Age of Enlightenment. He may have been divinely gifted, but he did not come from nowhere. He was shaped by surroundings and circumstances. He was compelled by mundane as well as elevated motives. He was an individual. He was a member of a tightly knit family. And he was also a member of a community of musicians that was both local and international. These memberships, these relationships, were immensely important to him. So this evening I would like to begin to explore how Mozart's sense of community developed as he grew from a child to a young man, and how the universal and the miraculous emerged and were woven into the very fabric of his identity. Most people know that Mozart was born and grew up in Salzburg, a small town, but the residence of a prince archbishop, and part of the widespread Austrian Empire under the rule of the Habsburgs. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a violinist and a teacher. He played in the court orchestra of the archbishop, and in the year his son was born, 1756, he published a book on the art of playing the violin. In both of his children, his son Wolfgang, as well as his older daughter Nannerl, he recognized outstanding musical talents. He trained them both from the earliest possible age, and when they were just old enough, he and his wife, Maria Anna Mozart, took them on short trips to nearby Munich, seat of one of the empire's prince-electors, and to the Austrian capital itself, Vienna. The parents clearly thought it important that their miraculous children should be brought to the attention of the highest people in the land, those who could influence a successful future for them. At the Schönbrunn Palace, they performed for the Empress Maria Theresia, whose establishment included a court orchestra, a theater, and many, many musicians, the best in the empire. The children were also introduced to the Empress's daughter, Maria Antonia, who within a few years would set off for France as bride to the Dauphin of France and become Marie Antoinette. But at this time, as a gifted musician herself, she was charmed by the young Mozarts and gave them her personal attention. When the children's portraits were painted, a short time after this trip, Wolfgang wore the fancy court dress that had been donated to him by the Empress herself. And as you can see in this picture, he already demonstrates a kind of poise and self-possession that are striking when you look at how he carries himself as he stands next to that keyboard. In 1763, when Wolfgang was 7 years old and his sister nearly 12, the family set off on what would be a 3-year excursion that would take them through France and as far as the Netherlands and England. The impact this trip had on their development as musicians, the wealth of experience it brought to their perspective on the world around them, cannot be overstated. As you can see from this list, they visited many cities, but the two that undoubtedly had the most import for Mozart's career were Paris and London. Paris in the 1760s was a highly stratified society with an aristocracy that revolved around a remote hierarchical court. Yet as child prodigies, Mozart and his sister were introduced to the king and queen, gained access to some of the nobility, and were even permitted to perform public concerts in a city where concerts were still strictly controlled and not numerous. They visited Versailles, where Mozart played the organ to great applause. They met the finest keyboard masters of the city, and Mozart published his first pieces, keyboard sonatas with violin accompaniment, that he was allowed to dedicate to one of the court's royal ladies. You see this, the title page of this in your slide up above on the right. And notice that he dedicated it to Madame Victoire, who was one of the great ladies of the court. And in fine print in the middle, it actually says that this young composer is only 7 years of age. So they were really capitalizing on this aspect of his life. He played in the celebrated salon of the Prince de Conti in the city of Paris, and was exposed to the lively conversation and pointed wit of Paris's intellectual elite. This image is a detail. It shows the child Mozart at a harpsichord with a nearby gentleman playing the guitar. The original painting itself is much, much larger, and its main topic is the conversation flowing through the different groups of persons in this large series of rooms. London was a densely populated, thriving city in Mozart's time, with a flourishing market for music and many public concerts. So it was a very different atmosphere from Paris. Here the Mozarts encountered a remarkably accessible court, with a genuinely musical king and queen who warmly welcomed these visitors from their own home country. Leopold Mozart wrote, "The kindness with which both His Majesty the King and the Queen received us is indescribable. You wouldn't have thought from their friendly nature that they were the King and Queen of England." The patronage of this court was valuable to Mozart. He published another set of sonatas, this time dedicated to the Queen herself. But even more valuable to him were the musical experiences available in the city. London was teeming with musicians from all over Europe. The King's Theatre offered Mozart his first prolonged exposure to Italian opera and Italian singers, including the Florentine castrato Giovanni Manzoli, who taught him singing lessons. He heard Handel's music for the first time. He was befriended by Johann Sebastian Bach's youngest son, Johann Christian, who was one of London's most successful composers. Under the influence of his new friends, Mozart composed his first concert aria and his first symphonies. The Mozarts visited a new institution, the British Museum, that represented one of the Enlightenment's great projects. Its trustees commissioned the young composer to write a piece, which led to his setting of an English text in this small motet that you see here, which is still among the many treasures of the museum. Of equal importance to this childhood grand tour were the 3 journeys across the Alps to Italy, which Mozart undertook in his teens with his father alone. Here he visited a lot of cities and underwent an intensive education in Italian music of all kinds, hearing operas at theaters in Verona, Cremona, Milan, Venice, and Naples, hearing liturgical music in the great churches of Bologna and Rome, listening to chamber music, especially for strings, everywhere he went. In Italy, he received commissions to write operas and worked extensively with singers, including old friends such as Manzoli. Here in Italy, he wrote his first string quartets, and he produced new symphonies. He played innumerable concerts, appearing as violinist as well as at the keyboard. Official honors of various kinds were bestowed upon him, including election to Bologna's celebrated Accademia Filarmonica and the presentation of the Order of the Golden Spur by the Pope. His portrait was painted at a beautiful old harpsichord in Verona. He and his father studied paintings, admired landscapes and architecture, and visited the antiquities at Pompeii and Herculaneum that were just being excavated for the first time. An evening of chamber music at the home of a Scottish nobleman in Naples, captured in the painting shown here, united him with Italian musicians, as well as with the English ambassador, Sir William Hamilton, who you see on the left. These Italian journeys drew Mozart into manhood as he took his place among professional musicians from whom he continued to learn, but to whom he in turn contributed. Now, in our time, Mozart's father, Leopold, has often been criticized as an overbearing, controlling parent who dominated his son and robbed him of a normal childhood. The childhood journeys have sometimes been viewed as a kind of carnival caravan, with its performing animals being paraded before one foreign court and audience after another, in search of fame and fortune. But I believe there is a more just and truthful way of comprehending these travels, which were undertaken at considerable sacrifice and with hardships for the entire family. Leopold and Maria Anna Mozart understood that they had been blessed with children of exceptional talent, and that such talent required, indeed demanded, exceptional nurturing. In the course of these journeys, young Mozart was exposed to all the great music that the major cities of the continent and England had to offer. In every city, he met the finest musicians, played with them, studied with them, made colleagues and friends that would last the rest of his life. He absorbed local styles in music making, including not only the products of theater and concert hall, but also folk and street music. He encountered great works of the past, from Handel's oratorios in London to Renaissance polyphony in Rome. He met the foremost instrument makers and played a staggering variety of keyboard instruments. He was introduced to the publishing world and made his first contributions to the musical marketplace. He learned to be at home and confident in every possible social setting and with kings as well as innkeepers. He learned multiple languages and how to set them to music as well as how to speak them. And they allowed him to read a variety of literature, including progressive thinkers like Fénelon and Rousseau in French, and the Arabian Nights in Italian. He studied paintings, sculpture, natural curiosities, visited museums, galleries, churches, archaeological sites. Taken all together, we would be quite right to view this as one of the most rigorous, comprehensive, and formidable apprenticeships ever devised. It's clear that the Mozart parents possessed a kind of genius of their own in cultivating it with such astounding effect in their children, and most especially in their son. Having guided a boy exploding with potential into a polished, seasoned artist, the Mozarts were eager to launch him into a professional career. In 1777, Mozart set out on another lengthy journey, this time accompanied only by his mother, with the express aim of finding a job. He spent several months in Mannheim, home of a splendid court orchestra, where he clearly hoped to secure a post. He then spent several more months in Paris, and all along the way continued to compose and perform. Yet when no job materialized, hard to believe, but that's the case, and when his mother died while in Paris, Mozart had no choice but to return to Salzburg. The commission for the opera Idomeneo took him back to Munich in 1780, where he worked again with the wonderful musicians of the Mannheim Orchestra, and it was only a year later that he would find himself again in Vienna, this time to stay. His travels would not entirely be over, as you can see on my list. Even as a husband and father with personal and professional obligations in Vienna, Mozart retained a restless eagerness instilled in his youth to reach out and be part of the wider world. So let's think again about this notion of universality and consider what it might mean in terms of the many influences from many places that he absorbed in his youth and continued to synthesize throughout his life, and also what it means in terms of those local and international communities that I spoke of some minutes ago. Why not consider just the pieces that we have on the program before us this evening? Let's take, for example, the Oboe Concerto, written for an Italian player in the Salzburg Court Orchestra. Mozart took it with him in 1777 when he went to Mannheim. The Mannheim Orchestra was full of great soloists, like the Detroit Symphony, so it played lots of concertos featuring them. It was especially blessed with terrific wind players, and Mozart became friendly with the oboist Friedrich Ramm, whom he said had a fine, splendid tone. He presented Ramm with his oboe concerto and enjoyed playing it with him. In a letter, he said, in French, that it was Ramm's cheval de bataille, his war horse. He and Ramm would meet again in Paris that summer, later again in Munich and Vienna, and he would write other great oboe parts for him. The horn concerto was written for another friend, Joseph Leutgeb, who Mozart knew as a boy in Salzburg. They would both end up in Vienna. Mozart was already attracted to horns and their sounds as a boy when writing his first symphonies in London, which was a city full of good horn players. He said to his sister, "Remind me to give the horn something worthwhile to do." We owe Mozart's marvelous Symphonie Concertante to his time spent in Paris and Mannheim. This genre, which is essentially a concerto with more than one soloist, was extremely popular in Paris. The majority of such pieces that survive were either written by French composers or by foreign composers working in Paris. And Mannheim composers wrote lots of them, both in Paris and at home. The Symphonie Concertante illustrates brilliantly the social changes taking place around 1770, with the rise of a bourgeois class and expansion in public concerts. Such audiences were attracted to virtuosity and ready to be dazzled and astonished. Instrumentalists who wanted to make a name for themselves and to improve their status and income found this a very successful genre to pursue. So Mozart was exposed to it in Mannheim, and when he found himself in Paris in April 1778 with Mannheim wind players, he started writing a Symphonie Concertante for them. When he got back to Salzburg, he decided to introduce this fashionable genre to his friends and audiences there. And in the summer and fall of 1779, he wrote two, one for violin, viola, which we'll hear, and the other for violin, viola, cello, and orchestra, which unfortunately was left unfinished. We know nothing about the first performances of this piece, but the Salzburg Court Orchestra was full of good string players, and Mozart himself had been performing on the violin a great deal during the 1770s, so it's quite possible that he played it himself. Finally, we'll be hearing the overture to the Marriage of Figaro, and this is a sterling example of both the universal and the miraculous in Mozart's work. It's an opera in the comic opera buffa style with an Italian libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. Mozart's lengthy apprenticeship in Italy, his thorough acquaintance with its theatrical traditions, and his already extensive experience in writing Italian operas meant that he approached this project in 1786 with absolute command of his material. But there's more to it than this. The original play on which this libretto was based was French, written in 1778 by Pierre de Beaumarchais as a sequel to his popular comedy, The Barber of Seville. Beaumarchais stated that it was the Prince de Conti, the cultivated nobleman in whose salon Mozart had played years before, who had encouraged him to write The Marriage of Figaro. But its puncturing of aristocratic pride and privilege was seen as so inflammatory in a time of rising social unrest that King Louis XVI at first banned the play from performance. Only after its setting was changed from France to faraway Spain was it finally permitted in 1784 to move to the stage, and it quickly became the most popular play of its time. After its publication in 1785, Mozart and da Ponte moved swiftly to adapt it as an opera and had it ready to present within a year, but not without encountering official resistance of their own. The universality of this opera lies not simply in its multilingual, cross-cultural origins, but in its fluent mingling of high, low, and middle classes, of aristocratic characters and servant characters that stand as equals in conspiracy, opposition, and love. This equality, which loomed as a threat to the monarchs in France and Austria who initially censored this work, was seized upon by Mozart as a strength. His music humanizes and brings depth to every character in the drama, binding us in sympathy with the servants Figaro and Susanna from the very first scene, enlisting us in the comic machinations involving the Count, and engaging us in the tenderness of the final scene of reconciliation. The power of Mozart's music to achieve so much is indeed nothing short of miraculous. But it is no accident that these miracles were created by a composer who had traveled much and seen a great deal, who possessed a keen, observant eye and an appreciation for the deep value of human connection. Mozart's identity as a citizen of Europe and a product of the Enlightenment informed all of his work and remains one of the most vibrant aspects of his legacy. Thank you very much.